Well, for the longest time now, Kenya has been facing the twin challenges of low productivity as well as competitiveness. And before we could deal with these two challenges, the issue of coronavirus came knocking. And this has complicated the labor relations in this country. How is the government dealing with these, and how is the partnership between the private sector as well as the public sector expected to help ease the suffering of many Kenyans? Joining us tonight on Inside Government is Peter Tum. He's the Principal Secretary in the Ministry of Labour and Social Protection Services. Thank you so very much indeed for finding time to be with us. You know, the challenge of COVID-19 in the Kenyan labor environment, I mean, is completely unprecedented. You have a situation whereby, employees, have been asked to cut or to expect, a pay cut, going forward. You have companies, closing down and or scaling down the operations, in the country. You have companies saying, hey, look here, people must proceed on leave without pay. Correct. This is not something that we have seen in the history of this nation. How has this been a lesson to government in terms of retooling its policies and relooking at our labor laws?
I can be able to say that though it came as a surprise to all of us the world over, this pandemic, the Kenya government quickly swung into action and ensured that those who were affected were not thrown out of work in a sense that then they would suffer. And that is why I've told you the programs that came up. Now, it was a learning lesson for all of us. One, we realized that issues to do with labor relations must be taken to another level. What we came up with was a platform for the social partners and the government. And when I talk about the social partners, the court, and the FKE, CAM, and the rest of them. And you remember there are specific sectors that were hard hit. Tourism sector was seriously hit. Hotel industry was also hit. Manufacturing and the small SMEs were really hit. So that then brought us together and we said, hey, let's sit down and see how then we can be able to mitigate against this. So first and foremost, the labor relations issues were brought to the fore. That there is a time like this that we need to sit as a government and work out ways and means of mitigating against the same. Now, the problem that we were facing as a government was the issue that we are having new vulnerables that were now coming out of the market. Industries were not able to pay them. So what did we need to do going forward? And from the Ministry of Labour perspective, we are saying we need to put in place a mechanism going forward that would ensure that whenever we have this kind of calamity, then there is a fallback position. Remember, it affected those who are employed locally. It affected employees that are migrant workers working outside this country. So we are coming back and we are telling ourselves we have to put in place a mechanism that would ensure that those that are affected within are taken care of.
What kind of a mechanism are you looking at?
So for those that are employed outside this country, we are saying that we are coming up with a fund, a migrant fund that would address their issues when they return to this country, whether we have COVID, whether we have any other calamity, or when they finish their tour of duty. They should be able to come back to some sort of fund that had been, kept by government and contributed into by the workers themselves that would allow them now reintegrate themselves into the country. And this is beside NSSF, right? There has to be some sort of an insurance cover that would then, because when COVID came, we had now issues of, occupational health and safety. So we have to have some fund that would be able to address those issues so that those who are affected in their places of work can have an insurance policy that can be able to cover them. So there are so many programs now that we are putting into place to take care of our workers going forward. And these are the lessons we've learned from this COVID-19 pandemic.
I mean, we have also seen, the Federation of Kenya Employers, saying that it is high time, the alternative dispute resolution mechanism, is activated in this country, in anticipation of probably maybe the high number of cases, pitting employers vis-a-vis employees in this country. When would we expect to have ADL put in place?
I think what we haven't done is to popularize the ADR mechanism. But already we have institutionalized ADR mechanism. It is domiciled in this ministry, and it's working very well. Despite the issues that we've had in the recent past as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, you can see there is some industrial peace. Of course, people have left employment, but they have left in a manner that is very amicable, because what we are doing as a ministry is to monitor the separation in terms of employment between the employer and the employee. Is it taking care of the interests of both parties? And if it is not, we kick in the ADR mechanism so that they don't end up in court. So what I can say in a nutshell is that that process is already here. Remember, in 2019, we gazetted 13 conciliators that are then taking through that process of ADR. So it is here, it is working, and it's really helped us during this period of the pandemic.
Are the employers and employees aware of the ADR mechanism? I mean, look, before you joined, the Ministry of Labour, you came from the Ministry of Health, where you used to deal with strikes on a daily basis, from nurses to doctors. You have come into another environment, whereby these issues, are supposed to be domiciled. This is where they're supposed to be dealt with. But still in this country, we're still experiencing serious upsurge in numbers of strike, from county employees, to nurses, to health employees. How then do we plan, to tame this rising number of strikes, by using the ADR mechanism?
Disputes between employers and employees have not been subjected to the ADR mechanism. You know that ADR is specifically to ensure that both parties understand their problems. And there is somebody sitting there to undertake arbitration. But once that arbitration process does not work for one reason or the other, they have avenues. They can be able to go to courts. They can be able to, declare those strikes. And because we've set this ADR mechanism in motion over a period of time, say 1 year now, we've seen the issues that would have escalated into full-blown strikes being mitigated upon and worked on. And because we are not publicizing the outcomes of the ADR resoluted cases, one might imagine that is not working. But let me tell you, the ministry has handled the case of Kalpa under that ADR mechanism.
Between Kalpa and KQ.
Kalpa and KQ. And it's worked very well. We set in place an arbitration mechanism. Those that had been gazetted were picked, 3 of them, 3 conciliators. They worked very well, and I want to take this opportunity to thank the leadership of the union, Kalpa itself, and KQ, for having agreed to sit down and work out the issues amicably. We have a Labour Commissioner here that then oversees that process. We've also sorted very many other aspects of strikes that would have escalated into the same. I'll mention them in numbers if I have time, but there are quite many. But those that now could not be sorted out by that process ended up in courts. And you can remember one like KNH. That was a salary issue. We needed to come in and have discussions, but we arbitrated as a ministry. And that is why we did not have the nurses go on strike. They just went for 1 day, and we sat down, we agreed, and they went back to work.
Where do you come in? I mean, as a ministry, when there's a dispute between working relations with county governments and their employees. And this has been a going concern, from teachers, employed by county government, to nurses, to health workers. Where are you coming in?
Most organizations have their an accord or an agreement that they sign between themselves and their unions, first and foremost. The Ministry of Labour then, when they receive a request that two parties need to enter into an agreement, oversees the legality of the same. That is according to instruments of governance that we have, i.e. Labour Relations Act, and the rest of them. Now, once that has been registered in court, it becomes a binding document. So Labour, in the first place, must have looked at the document, looked at it in terms of, whether it's within the Labour Relations Act and all the other instruments of governance, and then given it an okay now that it can be so that it can be registered in the courts. When that document now is at dispute, then Labour expects that one party or the other registers the same dispute with us. So it is up to us now to see whether we can subject it to an ADR or other processes so that we can be able to bring the two parties together. And that is when we bring in the ADR, and if the ADR does not work, there are other avenues of arbitration that both parties are allowed to follow.
From where you sit, do you believe that, the Kenyan worker has become more litigious?
The Kenyan worker is an informed worker because we have, as a government, put in place mechanisms to address issues of both the employer-employee. And we put in place mechanisms to ensure that each and every party within that Labour Relations Act is appraised of their rights. So when one is appraised and understands their rights very well, then that is when you realize that then the rights of each one of them, employer, employee, is taken care of. So it is not that they are just beginning to become litigious. They are just, getting to know their rights and wanting to be, their rights to be heard.
In the last, 24 months, the country has seen about 126 strikes, from different workers, in different entities, from, national government, be it county government workers. But when you look at the Labour Act, it does not, the Constitution, guarantees that people, it is their right, to go on strike. It is their right to picket. But it seems like, workers have picked that on isolation, to agitate for better pays, to agitate for better working environment. And the concern that is being raised is, are we not impacting our productivity levels with all these strikes?
I agree with you partly. It's true that when an organization, resorts to going on strike, the workers in that organization go on strike, the effects are devastating. And they are more devastating in other sectors than the others. Healthcare, for example. Aviation industry, for example. Those are areas that, when people go on strike, we have lots of problems as a country. But are they justified? The answer could be yes. The answer could be no. Why? Because, like you rightly say, the Constitution allows that people must picket. And then the same Constitution comes back and says, but you must agree on how you do that. As a ministry now, what we've decided to do is that we are passing through a legislative process where we will need to describe the kind of services that shouldn't go on strike until certain threshold are met. And we are looking at health, we are looking at aviation, we are looking at, power generating plants. They have a right to go on strike. because if someone interferes with your source of income in one way or another, I think you have the right to picket. But what are those conditions? What is that threshold that you must achieve in order to go on strike?
And this is long overdue. I mean,
that is what we are doing at the
we've seen a situation whereby, you know, health practitioners, you know, they have gone on strike, you know, to the detriment of health, you know, of Kenyans, you know, patients and so forth. And so help us understand, you know, the proposed law review, what aspect of it, you know, will come into force to ensure that the rights of workers is protected and the rights of Kenyans is also not interfered with?
What we are doing at the moment is that, you know, this is an interagency kind of, you know, framework that we are following, and Parliament has to be roped in. The office of the AG has also been roped in. So we've come up with an interagency committee that is looking into the areas of that constitution, you know, that would need to be, you know, tweaked in order to address some of those areas. Because like you've rightly said, a patient who is in Kenyatta, for example, who has a right to be treated, a right to treatment. The constitution says the same. But then again, how do you draw the line between now the rights of this patient and the right of the person, the paramedic or the doctor who is treating that patient? And you see, that is not something that you can easily just draw and say this is where we are. We are now working together with the Office of the Attorney General, the legislative arm of government, and ourselves to ensure that we come up with regulations that would address those areas.
And is the hope that of Kenyans that, you know, these issues, you know, are addressed quickly, you know, to alleviate, you know, future suffering? I mean, we have a situation whereby people have lost lives, you know, because of these strikes. You know, let's talk about, you know, productivity. And the government has been talking about the Kenyan wage bill, you know, which has risen significantly. But when you look at the productivity of a Kenyan, I mean, stuck at around 2%, 2.4%, from about 0.4%, you know, about in 2007. And this has not grown in tandem with improved remuneration. How do we plan to deal with this?
Productivity is something that the government has been working on, particularly on the formal employment. And that department is domiciled here, by the way. When we were doing introduction of the ministry, I did not tell you that we have 5 departments under the Department of Labour. We have Labour, is the one you know, that talks about issues, that looks into the issues of employer-employee relations and all that. And then we have a department that does the registration of trade unions and monitors also the same. We also have the Department of Occupational Health and Safety that looks into that aspect of the safety and the environment of workplaces. And then we have the productivity unit within, it is actually a directorate. And what we are doing as a government is we are enhancing productivity in both the formal and informal sectors of employment. Remember, we have around 15 or so million employees in the informal. We have around 2.8 or around 3 million employees informal. So when we tease up productivity in that sector, you can imagine what would happen, particularly in industry and the efficiency within which we will be doing our work. So that is a bit new department, and we are working very closely with the private sector to ensure that then productivity issues are addressed. We've done that in tea sector. Let's say agricultural sector, 50% of that agricultural sector is working with the department. We are also in manufacturing and apparel, and that is also being keenly followed by my ministry. And what we are saying is that both government and private sector must ensure that issues to do with productivity are given the due weight in whatever they are doing. And we've seen a success stories. Like when I came into this ministry, we have had Rivertex. They are the proud, consumers of productivity, training, and they have improved their productivity by a very good margin. And we are looking at it as an example that would then speak to the other areas of the economy.
And the reason why this case has been allowed to get to where it is now is because of the fact that as a country we do not have a proper policy on wages and remuneration of workers. As a ministry which is supposed to develop these kind of policies, do we have plans to develop these policies, and if yes, by when?
We have the wages and remuneration councils that are addressing specific sectors of the economy in this country, and they are being run efficiently. By the time now we are going to address issues on Labour Day, these are the teams that have sat, have looked at them.
Concentrate on the minimum wage.
They have looked at the economy. They are looking at the minimum wage. SRC is also with us. It's a constitutional body that is looking at the wages.
Which is for the public sector.
Which is also for the public sector. So what has happened is that both groups, that the SRC and the wages councils that are being managed from this ministry, are the ones now that study the economy of the country, and they are able to advise on the wages of workers in this country.
I'm talking about a policy, that articulates that if you work for this kind of an environment, this is what you ought to be paid, as opposed to the blanket minimum wage, that is prescribed on all workers. And remember, people work in different environments. There are people who work in the high seas. There are people who work in extreme environment. There are people who work in not so extreme environment. So how do you come up with a policy to ensure that each person, is remunerated accordingly?
You are talking about wages based on specific productivity levels or productivity environments that are existing. As a ministry, the kind of, wage levels that we've been able to, give to workers and everybody else is that wage that they have agreed upon in their contractual agreements based on their productivity levels. But I see where you are coming from, and in other jurisdictions, yes, we are looking at productivity in terms of what you can be able to do within what period of time, and then they peg it on the payment. And this is works in progress, and as a ministry we are looking into those other areas, because remember, by the way, at the end of the day, the advisory of the policies that we undertake as ministry is tripartite in nature, or we have to have the social partners also working with us. And discussions are ongoing on all those other aspects you've discussed about, including job evaluation strategies that we have undertaken as government. We need to evaluate the jobs that are being given by the private sector so that we can also be able to guide. And you cannot be able to do that, particularly in the private sector, on your own. We have to do it together with FKE and other players in that aspect.
Finally, as we wind up, what do you think should be done to better the Kenya's labor environment going forward?
Two things. The first one is to improve on dialogue, number one, between the social partners and the ministry. And this has worked very well. In the recent past, that is what we've leveraged our efforts on, by the way, right? That we always have meetings that speak to the labor environment in this country. And in those meetings, we normally have the social partners, and the social partners here, we are talking about CAM, employers and employees. Yeah. So employers would become FKE, KEPSA, and the rest of them. And then on the issue of the employees, we have KOTU, because it is a it's a federation that has affiliates. So when they speak on behalf of very many of them, except TUK, for example, that also comes in to have discussions with us. That is number one. Number two is that we are quickly looking at regulations so that we can be able, the acts or the instruments of governance that we are currently using are the ones of 2007. That is before the Constitution.
So you're talking about 13 years ago?
We are talking about 13 years ago. And what we've done very quickly is that we've put together a team beginning last year that is looking at the various aspects of the Constitution and the acts that are there, so that we can be able to tweak, having in mind the environment under which we are now working as a government and as employees. And remember, things are changing pretty fast. The other day we were talking about information technology. Now we are talking about artificial intelligence. And we are mapping the same again as the future of work. So even as we're working on the legislation and the issues of governance within that space of employment and labor relations, we are also looking at the future. This thing called AI, how does it portend? Are we going to lose in terms of jobs? Or are we looking at ways and means of ensuring that we give people the right skills that are futuristic? And as a government, we set into motion a mechanism of anticipation
of what will happen in the future.
And as we speak, I had in my office here the PS youth. And basically what we were discussing is that future. We are saying the skills that were for yesteryears are quickly being eroded. And when you look at the youth that we are now churning out from universities and tertiary institutions, require to have had prior information on what skills they expect. So we have put in place, and we've discussed and agreed that we are going to rope in other agencies so that we can discuss that. And by January, we will have put in place a mechanism that speaks to two areas. One, skills for local employment. Two, skills that are required outside. And we are looking at the GCC countries that we have already been penetrated, and other countries that we've not penetrated. And why are we doing this? We are doing this because we are aware that we are generating 1.2 million youth into the market every year. And the economy can only be able to absorb 800 of them. What are we going to do with the 400?
400. Very good.
And that 400 is coming from KMTCs, they are coming from TVET institutions, they are coming from the universities. So we are saying this is a group that we really must work for.
Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Yes,
we'll keep on engaging on these topical issues.
You're welcome.
Very good. Well, we have been talking to the Principal Secretary, State Department of Labour. Our focus has been how to improve the labor environment in Kenya, the employee-employer relations in this country, and of course how to improve productivity as well as competitiveness in the Kenyan labor space. My name is O'Brien Kimani. Thank you for your time, and this has been Inside Government. Have a good night.